Good evening, everybody, or good morning from Los Angeles, where it's still rather early on a gray morning. So I want to talk this evening, indeed, about the populist protests against the corona lockdown in the US. Now, obviously, these protests were already ebbing in mid-May as restrictive measures began to be lifted, and they have, of course, been completely eclipsed in the last few weeks by the vastly larger wave of protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd. So why talk about the anti-lockdown protests now? My argument is that just as the pandemic itself remains with us, despite the widespread urge to declare it over and get on with normal life, so too do the underlying tensions brought into focus by the anti-lockdown protests. These tensions over expertise, over crisis, and over protection are likely to loom even larger in the months ahead. The protests against corona restrictions appear paradoxical from the point of view of the study of populism in three respects. The paradox of expertise is that populism, which is generally understood as hostile to expertise, could flourish during a medical emergency when people are looking to scientists for tests, treatment, and vaccines, to public health professionals for guidance, and to medical experts for care. The paradox of crisis is that populism, which thrives on crisis and indeed often depends on fabricating a sense of crisis, has here accused mainstream politicians and the media of overblowing and even inventing the corona crisis. And the paradox of protection is that populism, which is ordinarily protectionist, has presented itself as anti-protectionist during the pandemic. That is, it has challenged the allegedly overprotective nanny state, and instead of advocating closure against threatening forms of openness, as populism usually does in recent years, it has demanded the reopening of spaces that had been closed in the name of protecting health and saving lives. So what I want to do this evening is say something about each of these paradoxes in turn before speculating in my conclusion about how populist distrust of expertise, antipathy to government regulation, and skepticism toward elite overprotectiveness may come together in the context of intersecting medical, economic, political, and epistemic crises in a potent and potentially dangerous mix. So a few clarifications and qualifications before I jump in. First, populism is perhaps too solid a word for what I'll be talking about. It risks reifying what I prefer to think about as a discursive and stylistic repertoire, a set of tropes, gestures, and stances. Secondly, this is not a talk about populist movements or parties or leaders, but rather about a loose complex of tropes and gestures. Third, I don't claim that the politicization of the pandemic is best understood through the analytical lens of populism. This is just one of many relevant analytical angles. And lastly, I'll be talking almost exclusively about the US. Some of my themes will have parallels and resonance elsewhere, but much of what I will have to say will reflect the distinctiveness of the American experience of the pandemic, and also the distinctive salience of anti-intellectualism, libertarian anti-statism, and myths of self-reliance in American political culture. So let me start with the paradox of expertise. How could there be much room for populism, and specifically for its relentless attacks on expertise and experts, at a moment when experts and expertise have seemed more indispensable than ever? The pandemic has obviously increased the demand for experts, not only as advisors to decision makers, but also as communicators to the public. It has dramatically increased the influence, the visibility, and the accessibility of epidemiologists and other public health experts. But precisely this influence, this visibility, and this accessibility have made that expertise vulnerable to populist attack. So the paradox of expertise is only an apparent paradox. Expertise is vulnerable to challenge and attack, not in spite of its being indispensable, but precisely because it is indispensable and because the stakes are so high. There's nothing new about this vulnerability. The inexorably increasing scientization of politics, as Gil et al. Put it, necessarily brings with it the politicization of science. Expertise is continually called upon to help rationalize and legitimize policy decisions that necessarily advantage some and disadvantage others. So in the present crisis, decisions justified with reference to expertise have devastated some and existentially threatened them while merely inconveniencing others. So it's no surprise that expertise would come under attack. The influence of epidemiologists has been truly unprecedented. Never before, arguably, has so narrow a network of experts exerted so decisive and so incalculably far-reaching an effect on the course of world events, upending the lives of billions and plunging the world economy into its deepest crisis since the Great Depression. The lockdowns initially enjoyed broad public support, but as they moved through their second and into their third month, and as the medical emergency became less immediately and urgently threatening, these drastic measures and the expert advice on which they were predicated have become an irresistible focal point for popular anger and frustration. That anger and frustration have, of course, been overshadowed in recent weeks by the anger and frustration expressed in protests against police brutality and racism. But the anger and frustration about the lockdown have not gone away, even as restrictive measures have been relaxed. And in the context of an unprecedented economic crisis, the political significance of that anger and frustration is certain to increase rather than diminish. And the experts, as well as the politicians who listen to them, are likely to be blamed for the economic carnage the lockdowns caused. Besides the extraordinarily concentrated, consequential, and visible influence of expertise, I want to highlight two additional factors. The first is the gap between what people know relatively directly from common sense and personal experience and what people know about from expert models and projections. This epistemic gap gives rise to what I will call the experiential challenge to expertise. The second factor is the hyper-accessibility of expertise. And this gives rise to what I'll call the participatory challenge to expertise. So let me first say a few words about the experiential challenge. Populism tends to valorize common sense and concrete personal experience, and it tends to be suspicious of abstract and experience-distant forms of knowledge. And it's easy to see how the corona crisis has activated this suspicion. The extreme unevenness of the pandemic has created a huge discrepancy between what many people have seen in their own local surroundings, few illnesses, fewer deaths, empty hospitals, and so on, for example, and the dire picture reported from hotspots or projected for the country as a whole. Nearly half of America's approximately 3,000 counties have not reported a single COVID-19 death, and 80% of those counties have reported fewer than 10 deaths. So many residents of rural and small town America could easily think that the crisis was overblown and the lockdown unnecessary. As one Oklahoma protester put it, we're not New York. Their problems are not our problems. The widely publicized disproportionate vulnerability of minorities and African Americans in particular, of the inner city poor, of the incarcerated, and of immigrant workers in meatpacking plants may reinforce the tacit or explicit sense on the part of many residents of low prevalence areas that this is not their pandemic, but one that afflicts others. Anti-lockdown protesters could draw, at least implicitly, on the long-standing and of course deeply racialized populist trope that contrasts the morally, politically, and even biomedically healthy heartland, the so-called real America of locally rooted communities and virtuous, hardworking, ordinary citizens, with the big cities, seen as sites of corruption, criminality, and disease, and understood as being dominated by liberal cosmopolitan elites on the one hand, and by racial, ethnic, religious, sexual, and gender minorities on the other. Needless to say, the massive protests in cities across the country, especially during the several days during which police clashed with protesters, looting was widespread, and the National Guard was mobilized, all this has made the trope even more accessible. The epistemic gap between local experience and expert knowledge also has a temporal dimension, and this is relevant not only in rural and small town America. Epidemiological time is exponential time. If you have an easily transmissible pathogen, a small outbreak can quickly become a disaster. The urgency of expert warnings and the case for stringent distancing depended on this exponential temporality. Yet precisely because the warnings were taken seriously, they could become, as it were, self-discrediting, since the lockdowns suspended exponential temporality and the projected catastrophe never happened. This is what is sometimes called the paradox of prevention. Measures taken to avert an outcome, if they are successful, can be seen in retrospect as having been unnecessary. So here too, the gap between local experience and expert projections can breed suspicion and distrust of expertise. I turn now to the participatory challenge to expertise. Here, expertise is challenged not on the terrain of everyday experience and common sense, but on the terrain of data. The participatory challenge feeds off what I'll call the hyper-accessibility of expertise. Now, by hyper-accessibility, I don't, of course, mean that it's easy to acquire expertise, however we define that slippery term. I mean, rather, that expert opinions, expert models and projections, and expertise-relevant data are more accessible and more abundant than ever. Experts have not simply advised governments, they've also been keen to address the public. They have sought to build support for disruptive distancing measures, but they've also sought to enlist the public in altering their behavior, and thereby in altering the course of the very event that they seek to model. Experts have addressed the public both directly through op-ed contributions, interviews, podcasts, and Twitter feeds, and indirectly by talking extensively with journalists. Their views, along with journalists simplifying accounts of those views, have then been recirculated at high velocity, though also, of course, in fragmented and distorted form by legions of digitally active lay users. But it's not only expert opinions that are hyper accessible. It's also the raw materials on the basis of which expert opinions are formed and revised. The projections, the research findings, and the public health data. You've all seen the many tracking and forecasting projects that convey daily updates, trends, and forecasts on cases, deaths, tests, and hospitalizations. And many of these allow users to download the raw data, so data-sophisticated users can easily explore the data on their own. And voluminous streams of new research are freely accessible on preprint servers, not only published work, but also papers, indeed mainly papers, that are not yet peer-reviewed. So there's an enormous glut of data and research findings. Now I want to highlight two implications of the hyper-accessibility and superabundance of COVID-related expertise, research, and data. One is the proliferation of the means of assessing expertise. For what is accessible in the digital public sphere, or what appears to be accessible, is not only the content of expert opinion, but also the evidence that supports or undermines it. So it's easy to find raw data or new research that can be taken or, of course, mistaken as suggesting or even proving, as some would claim, that the experts got it wrong in this way or that. For example, it's easy to cite research and numbers that suggest that COVID-19 is much less dangerous than the experts claim. Indeed, no more dangerous than the seasonal flu. And it's easy, therefore, to claim that the lockdown was a catastrophic mistake, the greatest mistake in history, as one commentator rather grandly put it. Yet the hyper-accessibility and superabundance of expertise and research also make it easy to come to what is, in a sense, the opposite and equally problematic conclusion, namely that the experts don't agree on anything. So in both respects, hyper-accessibility and superabundance can contribute to the undermining of the credibility of expertise. The second implication is the ease of claiming and exercising expertise, or at least some kind of quasi-expertise. Semi-experts, quasi-experts, pseudo-experts, and lay experts have proliferated. And even if it's not so easy, in fact, to claim expertise per se, it's at least easy to claim the right to join in as a knowledgeable participant in the collective public effort to interpret and define socio-medical reality. So as a prominent lockdown skeptic, Aaron Ginn, a self-described Silicon Valley growth hacker, put it, and I quote, "I'm quite experienced at understanding virality, how things grow, and data. You don't need a special degree to understand what the data says and doesn't say. Numbers are universal," close quote. Ginn's epistemologically populist claim to a seat at the table did not go unchallenged. His essay criticizing the case for the lockdown back in March racked up more than 2.5 million views on Medium in 24 hours, but it was removed by the platform after a scathing critique from a biologist. This was one of many interventions to have been removed. Concerns, of course, have been mounting in recent years about the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation in what you could think of as a structurally flat, unmediated, and in that sense, populist digital public sphere in which visibility is driven by algorithmically amplified popularity. And these concerns about disinformation and misinformation have, of course, intensified during the pandemic. And in response, the major platforms have been quite aggressive about removing or flagging content deemed potentially harmful from a public health standpoint. But this kind of aggressive and highly visible content moderation has raised concerns about censorship, and it's generated an epistemologically populist backlash. The removal of Ginn's essay, for example, prompted a Wall Street Journal article that has raised Gin's profile among lockdown skeptics who can complain with good reason, at least in the early phase of the lockdown, that major digital platforms have been colluding in restricting the range of what they deemed to be legitimate views. Now, this participatory challenge to expertise is not new. It has roots in the long-term developments in the cultural politics of knowledge. These include the decline of what you could call epistemic deference, the long-standing suspicion of insular forms of expert judgment, the valorization of various forms of lay expertise, and the growing sense, especially in health and lifestyle domains, that people must educate themselves and take responsibility for arbitrating between competing expert claims. But the pandemic and the flood of data that it has unleashed have given a major new impetus to this longstanding participatory challenge, and this may further discredit and destabilize expertise. So the crisis of expertise is systemic and longstanding, yet beyond this chronic crisis, if you will allow me an oxymoron, COVID-19 confronts us with a more specific epistemic crisis, a crisis of public knowledge. It's not only, and I quote here from an interesting paper on, quote, post-normal science, it's not only, and I quote, that facts are uncertain, stakes high, values in dispute, and decisions urgent. It's also that we inhabit radically different public worlds. What we know or what we believe about COVID-19, and I don't mean here just what we think ought to be done, but what is the case, this is radically discrepant. There's no broadly shared definition of the situation. For some, COVID-19 is the greatest threat, greatest existential threat in our lifetimes. For others, as noted above, it's no more dangerous than the seasonal flu. For some, the lockdowns prevented 60 million COVID infections in the US and nearly 300 million in China, and saved more than 3 million lives in Europe, as a recent study claimed. For others, lockdowns were not only medically ineffective and economically catastrophic, but are likely to have disastrous public health consequences, especially in poor countries, disrupting vaccination programs, which has already happened, and possibly even tipping already vulnerable populations into mass starvation. Now, there's much more to be said about the populist challenge to COVID expertise, but I want to turn now very briefly to the paradox of crisis. Populism thrives on crisis. It even depends on crisis. Populists often seek to cultivate, to exacerbate, or even to create a sense of crisis. Yet the pandemic has occasioned a curious reversal. It is now populists who have been accusing mainstream politicians and the media, and of course public health experts as well, of blowing the corona crisis out of all proportion. It's of course true that some populist leaders in power, of course Orban, but also Serbia's Aleksandar Vučić and India's Narendra Modi, have embraced the crisis and have used it to justify emergency measures that have tightened their authoritarian grip on power. In opposition, however, the dominant populist tendency has been to downplay the seriousness of the pandemic and to turn the tables by accusing incumbents of exploiting the corona crisis in order to illegitimately expand state power, suspend rights, and deepen surveillance. The paradox then is that instead of performing crisis, populism has here seemed to be performing non-crisis, performing normality, if you like, in the face of an establishment in full crisis mode. But again, the paradox is only apparent. Populists have, in fact, been seeking to capitalize on crisis. But the crisis on which they have been seeking to capitalize is, of course, the economic crisis, not the medical crisis. And because of the unevenness of the pandemic, the economic crisis has seemed much more threatening to many people than the medical crisis. And anti-lockdown protesters in the US, but also in some other places, notably in Germany, have sought to stage and provoke a political crisis. The emergency regulations issuing from the overblown medical crisis, in their view, created a genuine political crisis. This was cast as a crisis of governmental overreach that trampled on fundamental rights, including the right to work, the right to move in public space, the right to free exercise of religion, the right to bear arms, the right to protest, the right to privacy, and the asserted right not to wear a mask. The progressive easing of restrictions throughout May weakened anti-lockdown protesters' efforts to provoke a political crisis along these lines. And of course, the political crisis they sought to provoke has been overtaken by another, broader political crisis. But the two crises are not unrelated. And the new crisis has in some ways hardened the anti-government stance that animated the populist effort to stage a crisis of government overreach. Anger at continuing restrictions on church services, for example, restrictions that were upheld by the Supreme Court in late May, just as the protest wave was gathering force, have been reinforced by the spectacle of huge crowds marching in the streets. And resentment of mask requirements has been reinforced by seeing people without masks, though of course most have worn masks, amidst tightly packed protests. So I turn now to my third and final paradox, the paradox of protection. We think of populism as protectionist. In recent years, this has meant claiming to protect the people economically, demographically, culturally, and physically from threats arising from unchecked globalization, from the neoliberal economy, from open borders, from cosmopolitan culture, all seen as favored by economic, political, and cultural elites. Yet faced with the coronavirus, populism has turned anti-protectionist. Populists have taken the side of openness against closure, and they have challenged what they see as the overprotective nanny state. They have cast the lockdowns as hysterical overreactions, criticized paths to reopening as overcautious, and sometimes challenged social distancing protocols as unnecessary. The paradox is heightened by the fact that conservatives and American anti-lockdown protesters, unlike their counterparts in Germany, have been overwhelmingly conservative. Conservatives tend to be generally more sensitive than liberals to signs of threat and danger, including specifically threats of germs and contamination. Now, you could argue that the paradox of protection, like the others, was only an apparent paradox. You could argue that the populism of lockdown opponents has indeed been protectionist, but that it has focused on protecting livelihoods and liberties rather than lives. But I don't think this is quite right. The demand to restore individual liberties in the context of emergency restrictions is a libertarian argument. I don't think it can be plausibly characterized as protectionist. Economic demands could be framed in protectionist terms, for example, as a demand for state action to protect jobs or to protect people from losing their health insurance or from being evicted from their homes. But this argument has not been made by anti-lockdown protesters. So I think there is here a real paradox, or at least a puzzle. Why has populism turned anti-protectionist during the pandemic? A key part of the answer, I think, is that populism, unlike, say, socialism or liberalism or conservatism, populism is not a substantive political ideology. It's substantively empty. Populism is relational and oppositional. It's defined by what it opposes. And what it opposes is formally always the same. It's always anti-elite. It's always anti-establishment. But it's substantively variable, depending on how the opposition between the people and the elite or the establishment is constructed. So populism in the global north has indeed been strongly protectionist in recent decades. And this made political sense in a context of hyper-globalization and hegemonic neoliberalism, in which economic, political, and cultural elites could plausibly be seen as indifferent to the bounded solidarities of community and nation. But today, there's no political profit in a protectionist critique of the status quo, since closed borders, renationalization, and deglobalization are the status quo. Okay, I know internal EU borders are reopening, but for example, even the US and Canada border is still closed and will be closed at least for another year. And we do see forms of deglobalization occurring. So if populism could not at present take a distinctively protectionist stance vis-a-vis the outside world, since that protectionist space has already been occupied, it could take a distinctively anti-protectionist stance vis-a-vis the domestic protectionist regime, because that regime of protection, that domestic regime of protection, could indeed be characterized in populist terms as a project of political, cognitive, public health, mainstream media, and professional elites. That is, these elites, so runs the argument, have been at best, inconvenienced by the regime of protection. They can work from home, they can continue to draw their salaries, they can afford the luxury of hyper protection. They can afford to minimize the risk of contagion at the expense of everything else. Now, on this account, the people cannot afford the luxury of lockdown level hyper protection. But the populist claim is also that the people don't need or want this degree of protection. Gendered imagery, which is often central to populism, comes into play here as well. The people are seen as tough, resilient, brave, and willing to take risks. The elite as soft, coddled, anxious, oversensitive, and risk averse. And gender symbolism is also, of course, central to the cultural politics of masks and mask wearing, though, of course, the performance of unmasked virility forgets that masks are less about protecting oneself than about protecting others. Protectionist elites have also been resented during the pandemic for their moralizing, scolding, and school teacherish stance. They have been cast in populist terms as all too eager to lecture ordinary people about how they should behave, and all too eager to reprimand them for their selfish heedlessness of others when they have violated social distancing guidelines. And since the protectionist elites have invoked the authority of science, the sudden pivot of many to applauding mass protests and minimizing their public health risks, or justifying those risks by appealing to a greater good, is easily seen by populists as undermining their authority and credibility. The pivot has been especially disconcerting when it has been made by public health experts. Populist skepticism of corona protectionism aligns with a broader popular skepticism of elite overprotectiveness in culture, education, and everyday life. This is a skepticism toward what one prominent book called safetyism, referring to the efforts of anxious parents to protect their children from even the most minimal risks, and to the demand for safe spaces and for the protection of students' feelings on American universities. So populist opposition to corona protectionism may have drawn some of its energy from this broader current of skepticism. So I come now to my conclusion. The pandemic has not generated a coherent or large-scale populist response, but the lockdowns have generated a reservoir of popular anger, and they have generated the emergence of a populist mood among substantial parts of the population. They have heightened distrust of expertise, exacerbated antipathy to government regulation, and amplified skepticism toward elite overprotectiveness. Could these forms of proto-populist discontent coalesce in a narrative according to which misguided and out-of-touch experts, power-hungry regulators, and excessively risk-averse elites combined to wreck the economy, destroy livelihoods, and trample on liberties? Might such a narrative gain broad public support? This cannot be excluded. What makes the present moment so fraught, in my view, is that the dynamics of medical, economic, political, and what I would call epistemic crises interpenetrate in complex and largely unforeseeable ways. The future course of the pandemic, for example, itself depends on many complexly interacting processes. Among these are what people believe or know about the pandemic and how they act on that knowledge, whether they wear masks, for example, whether and how they practice social distancing, as well as what decisions are made about the modalities and timing of reopening. But what people believe or know about the pandemic is shaped by chaotic and shifting public messaging, embedded in a polarized media ecosystem and colored by the challenges to expertise that I have described. And how they act depends not only on what they think or know, but also on social pressures and expectations in their immediate environment, as well as on contingent events like those that have brought large crowds of protesters to the streets in cities across the country. Decisions about modalities and timing of reopening, for their part, respond both to contested knowledge about the dynamics of the pandemic and to political pressures generated by the economic crisis and filtered through the prism of hyperpolarized partisan politics. So if the curve of infections, as seems likely, indeed certain, turns at least modestly upward as a result of these and other interacting processes, and indeed it's already turning upward in the US, if you subtract New York, this will generate new claims to knowledge and new pressures for action. But these new knowledge claims will remain deeply contested and beset with deep uncertainty. They will yield no unambiguous and uncontested guidelines for action. The crisis of expertise will deepen, and with it, the political crisis over how to respond to the pandemic, especially against the horizon of an approaching election. And this, of course, only begins to scratch the surface of the complex interpenetration of medical, economic, political, and epistemic crises. We should not complacently assume that the past is a good guide to the future. We are truly in uncharted territory. Thank you very much.